On June 13, 2025, at 2:30 a.m. Tehran time, Israeli aircraft launched a series of airstrikes on targets deep inside Iranian territory. The targets were a nuclear center in Fordow, a missile test site in Isfahan, and a research facility in Natanz. These were strategically important complexes that had been causing concern not only in Jerusalem but also in Washington in recent years. According to Israel, the strikes were in response to the buildup of Iranian missile platforms near the Syrian border, as well as intelligence about preparations for new nuclear tests. However, this came as a shock to Iran. Until then, its leadership had been considering the possibility of dialogue with the U.S. on the nuclear issue, with talks scheduled for June 15th. But the talks did not take place. Instead, an exchange of strikes began. On the evening of June 13th, Iran launched its first ballistic missiles at Israeli territory. The Iron Dome air defense system repelled some of the attacks, but damage to infrastructure in the Negev region was reported. The next day, mass rallies were held in Tehran, with calls for revenge for Ford. A phase of public mobilization began. The U.S. response was particularly resonant. On the night of June 21, 22, the U.S. Air Force, supported by the Navy, carried out a large-scale operation. GBU-57 bombs, known as massive penetrating munitions, were dropped on 3 key Iranian targets. The operation was unofficially named Iron Depth. The goal was to show that Iran's nuclear infrastructure was under control and to halt the development of the program. However, assessments of the consequences varied. Donald Trump said that the facilities had been completely and permanently destroyed. The military was more cautious. According to General Dan Kane, it was a significant but not complete destruction. Moreover, just 24 hours later, Iran launched missiles at U.S. bases in Iraq and Kuwait, in the most open attack on the U.S. in 2 decades. On June 23rd, Iranian missiles reached territory where U.S. military bases are located. The targets were a logistics center near Basra, Iraq, and the Al Jaber Air Base in Kuwait. Although U.S. officials said that serious casualties were avoided thanks to timely warning and evacuation, satellite images showed damage to the runway and an ammunition depot. Against this backdrop, U.S. President Donald Trump made a public initiative. He proposed a complete and permanent ceasefire between Iran and Israel. According to Trump, both sides had allegedly agreed, and the truce was to take effect 6 hours after the end of the current operations. This statement was made on the night of June 24th and was presented as a historic breakthrough. The Israeli side initially confirmed its readiness for a ceasefire. The defense minister, speaking on Channel 12, said, "We have achieved our tactical objectives and are ready to stop if Iran stops its aggression." However, within a few hours, reports came in of new launches from Iranian territory. According to Israeli air defense, 3 missiles were fired toward Tel Aviv, 2 were intercepted, and 1 damaged infrastructure in the south of the city. These events finally undermined confidence in the ceasefire statements. Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz ordered preparations for strikes on command posts of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Moreover, discussions began in government circles about the need to expand the operation deeper into Iranian territory, up to the capital region. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in Tehran was completely different. State media broadcast footage of missiles being launched, showing smiling soldiers and commentators claiming that Iran was repelling aggression. The main event was a public address by the country's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, in which he declared, "The Zionist regime has been almost defeated and crushed by the blows of the Islamic Republic." This statement provoked a violent reaction in Iran and beyond. It sounded like a political declaration and a signal. Tehran not only has no intention of backing down, but considers what is happening a victory. Immediately after the failure of the ceasefire, Israel began to implement its military doctrine of containment, stepping up operations simultaneously on three strategic fronts: air, information, and diplomatic. It became clear that the conflict could no longer be resolved through simple negotiations. The opening of three fronts meant that Israel and its allies were preparing for a protracted confrontation with Tehran. The first front was military and air. The Israeli Air Force continued to strike targets in Syria and Iraq, where, according to intelligence reports, Iranian weapons depots and bases of pro-Iranian groups were located. Operation Mirror Fire was aimed at eliminating logistics hubs and command posts through which Iran coordinated attacks by proxy groups. In a single day, at least 14 airstrikes were carried out on Hezbollah and Shiite positions in western Iraq and southern Lebanon. The second front is cyberspace. Israel's Unit 8200, with the support of the U.S. Cybersecurity Agency, launched a large-scale cyber operation against Iran. The targets were government servers, energy infrastructure, and military command systems. According to Israeli sources, the cyber attacks paralyzed the broadcasting of two IRIB television channels and disrupted the airspace monitoring system. Iran, in turn, said that the cyber attacks were massive but repelled. However, the third front proved to be the most difficult: diplomacy. Despite support from the U.S. and a number of EU countries, Israel faced growing pressure from the international community, demanding an immediate end to hostilities. The UN Secretary-General issued a strong statement accusing both sides of violating humanitarian law. China and Russia blocked a Security Council resolution condemning the Iranian strikes, effectively leaving Israel without international legal cover. At the same time, Iran stepped up its actions through its allies and proxy groups. In Yemen, the Houthis fired on Saudi Arabian oil facilities. In Lebanon, Hezbollah increased pressure on the Israeli border, and in Iraq, Shiite militias attacked convoys carrying U.S. supplies. This undermined regional stability and increased the risk of additional actors being drawn into the conflict. As the conflict developed, it became clear that Iran's strategy was not simply retaliatory strikes, but a well-thought-out scenario of escalation with asymmetric elements. Classic army warfare was complemented by proxy actions, cyber attacks, and information operations. It was this multi-layered approach that allowed Iran to remain flexible and take steps without officially crossing the line into total confrontation with the U.S. Proxy groups began to play a special role. In Lebanon, Hezbollah units carried out several attacks on Israeli territory from the South Litani area, forcing the IDF to redeploy some of its forces from the Iranian front. This weakened the Israeli line in Syria, opening the way for arms smuggling from Iraq. At the same time, attacks were reported in Baghdad on coalition logistics facilities, including convoys and food warehouses. Cyber operations also reached a new level. Iranian hacker groups, believed to be linked to the IRGC, attacked gas networks and transport terminals in northern Israel. In one case, a pumping station control system was disabled, cutting off water supplies to several areas of Haifa. This caused a stir in the local media and increased pressure on the government. The international reaction was mixed. The Persian Gulf countries took a wait-and-see approach. The UAE and Qatar called for de-escalation, but did not directly condemn Iran. Saudi Arabia stepped up security at oil facilities, fearing that the conflict could spill over into its territory. Egypt limited itself to statements about the need for a diplomatic settlement. Russia and China took an openly pro-Iranian position. At a UN Security Council meeting, their representatives said that the U.S. and Israel bear direct responsibility for the escalation, and called for recognition of Iran's right to self-defense. This reversal called into question further attempts at international pressure on Tehran. Against this backdrop, Ali Khamenei's statement about the almost destroyed Zionist regime took on new meaning. This was not just an act of internal propaganda. It was a signal to the outside world. Iran is no longer playing the role of victim or opposition. It is claiming the position of a regional leader capable of standing up to global powers and imposing its own rules. While missiles destroyed military bases and drones attacked warehouses, an equally fierce battle unfolded in the global information space. The war for perception of what was happening became a separate front, where the stakes were no less than on the battlefield. From the first days of the conflict, Iran launched an active media campaign. State agencies such as IRNA, Press TV, and Tasnim published videos of missile launches, interviews with IRGC commanders, and analyses of victories over the Zionist regime and American aggressors. Videos showing the results of strikes against Israel and the U.S. were shared on social media and messaging apps, often without confirmation, but with a powerful emotional charge. Arabic and French-speaking audiences were particularly active. Thanks to the work of hundreds of accounts linked to Iranian PR structures, the media agenda quickly spread beyond the region. Forums and news aggregators in Lebanon, Iraq, Algeria, Indonesia, and even Nigeria were dominated by a single narrative. Iran had successfully repelled the aggression and imposed its rules. In this parallel war, Israel was less prepared. Its official sources published data sparingly, emphasizing the precision of operations, defensive nature, and minimization of casualties. However, to a broad audience, especially outside the West, this appeared weak. In a world where people perceive conflicts through short videos and flashy headlines, Israel's communication strategy was losing ground. The U.S., for its part, was also unable to set the information agenda. Donald Trump made several high-profile statements, but these were either perceived as political PR or contradicted military data. For example, his words about the complete destruction of nuclear facilities in Iran were refuted by the U.S. military itself, which damaged trust in the administration. Thus, the information front showed how important media strategy is in modern conflicts. Those who are quicker and more aggressive in shaping the narrative gain an advantage, even if they suffer losses on the ground. Iran understood this early on and took full advantage of it. In parallel with the state media, Iran actively deployed an army of accounts on Telegram, Twitter, X, Instagram, and YouTube. These accounts, some of which were controlled from Lebanon and Iraq, distributed video footage edited with cinematic flair, slow-motion shots of missile launches, marching guards, and clips from Khamenei's speeches set to epic music. The goal was obvious: to emotionally captivate the audience and cement the image of the victor. Against the backdrop of this activity, the West began to lose the battle for meaning. The U.S. and EU media, accustomed to fact-checking and cautious wording, lagged behind the speed of the information flow created by Iran. When the New York Times and the BBC published detailed analyses of the strikes a day later, Iranian Telegram channels already had millions of views on videos captioned "Strike on U.S. base," regardless of whether this was true. Statements by officials had a particular impact. For example, Khamenei's speech on June 26th, in which he declared that the Zionist regime has been almost destroyed, was instantly quoted and became a symbol for the pro-Iranian audience. Even if this statement did not correspond to the military situation, its perception as a moral victory became a powerful media tool. Such statements became the basis for rallies, video messages, and flash mobs. In addition, Iran effectively used the language of conflict, dividing the world into the oppressed and the aggressors. In this scheme, Israel and the U.S. represented the empire, while Tehran represented the resistance. This narrative proved particularly appealing to young people in Africa, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and even South America. Against this backdrop, even Iran's internal economic problems temporarily receded into the background. Propaganda actively emphasized that despite sanctions, isolation, and infrastructure strikes, the Islamic Republic stood its ground and fought back. This strengthened the regime's legitimacy and mobilized public opinion. In Israel and the U.S., things looked different. There, the information agenda was fragmented. Some media outlets criticized the government for insufficiently tough action, while others criticized it for excessive military aggression. This created a picture of disunity and uncertainty, while Iran demonstrated media unity and confidence. The information war, in essence, became further proof that in the 21st century, victory is not only about destroying targets on the ground, but also about controlling the interpretation of events. In this regard, Iran has achieved a success that will have consequences far beyond the current conflict. At the turn of June and July 2025, it became clear that there was no clear winner in the conflict, but all sides had paid a high price. Iran had consolidated its position as an independent and aggressive player. Israel had proven that it was capable of acting decisively and with technological precision. The U.S. had shown that it was ready to support its ally with military force. At the same time, however, all three states have reached a point beyond which begins what analysts call a balance of fear. This expression dates back to the Cold War, when the USSR and the U.S., possessing the means to destroy each other, refrained from open conflict. Today, in a changed world, it takes on new meaning. In the case of Iran and Israel, it is the realization that both sides have not only the will to wage war, but also the capability to inflict unacceptable damage on each other. After shelling, exchanges of strikes, and cyber attacks, Israel began openly preparing for a decisive strike. Intelligence confirmed the movement of additional units near the Golan Heights. The Green Network System, an operational plan for the mass mobilization of reservists, was activated. The media reported that a number of IDF units had been placed on combat alert. Everything pointed to Israel being ready to go further if Iran did not stop. Tehran, for its part, did not back down. Despite the destruction and strikes on its facilities, the government did not acknowledge any damage in any area. Reports leaked to the press about preparations for new missile launches, the strengthening of air defenses, and even the evacuation of certain military facilities. But the most important thing was the rhetoric. Khamenei made it clear in his speech, "The Republic will not retreat and will strike U.S. bases if the war continues." The world found itself in a situation where further escalation could lead to a chain reaction. The factor of regional destabilization looked particularly alarming. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, Iraq, each of these countries began to urgently review their military strategies and budgets. A new arms race was emerging in the region, fueled by fear of Iran and its potential to wage a protracted, technologically sophisticated war. The state of strategic tension in which the Middle East found itself no longer allowed the participants to act according to old patterns. Containment was no longer limited to demonstrations of force. A new paradigm was needed that took into account cyberspace, proxy wars, and information narratives. There was a need to rethink the entire regional security system. For the U.S., the main task was to prevent the conflict from escalating into open confrontation with Iran. Washington strengthened diplomatic channels through Oman and Qatar and attempted to mobilize international pressure, but faced growing mistrust from its partners. Countries in Asia and Latin America increasingly denounced the double standards of U.S. policy. This undermined the effectiveness of even those decisions that were taken quickly. Israel was faced with a choice: either continue its offensive strategy and risk a large-scale war, or start a political game, reserving the right to strike but giving diplomacy a chance. A debate began within the country. Some demanded to see it through to the end and, once and for all, deprive Iran of its nuclear potential, while others insisted on strengthening defenses and moving to negotiations. At the same time, the army continued to mobilize and expand its surveillance zones, including over the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. Despite its bombastic statements, Iran also understood that a full-scale war could have catastrophic consequences. The threat of new sanctions, economic collapse, and internal destabilization remained real. Therefore, instead of open attacks, Tehran intensified its proxy efforts. Drones, mortar attacks, and cyber-sabotage allowed it to strike without crossing the official red line. Meanwhile, international organizations such as the UN and the IAEA found themselves in the role of observers, unable to offer effective mechanisms for de-escalation. Proposals for an international conference on regional security remained at the conceptual level, without support from key players. France and Germany offered to mediate, but without the support of the US and China, this appeared symbolic. Thus, a new reality emerged, a balance of fear, where neither side could win, but neither could afford to lose. This balance is fragile, dependent on many factors: accidental incidents, misinterpretation of data, provocations by third parties. The world found itself in a dangerous balance that could be broken at any moment. When the first missiles struck Iranian targets, many thought it would be a short-term operation, similar to previous strikes on infrastructure. But within a few weeks, it became clear that the situation had gone beyond a tactical episode. The conflict between Iran, Israel, and the US has turned into a new phase of instability in the Middle East, the consequences of which will be felt for a long time to come. Analysts identify three main scenarios for how events could unfold. 1. A frozen conflict. This option assumes that after a series of exchanges of blows, the parties will reach a tacit understanding. The active phase of the war is over, but diplomatic peace will not be achieved. This has already happened in conflicts between Israel and Hezbollah, or between the US and Iraqi Shiite groups. In this case, the sides will remain combat-ready, proxy groups will periodically become more active, but open confrontation will be avoided. This scenario is advantageous in that it allows everyone to save face, but it also carries the threat of a sudden resumption of hostilities. 2. Escalation to a large-scale war. In this scenario, one of the sides, either Israel or Iran, will decide to eliminate the threat once and for all. Israel may try to strike Iranian command centers or IRGC leaders, while Iran may intensify attacks through Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen, including strikes on civilian targets. This would lead to a full-scale regional war involving the US and possibly other global actors. Such a development would be disastrous, leading to rising oil prices, mass migration, stock market crashes, and, most importantly, human casualties. 3. Reset through mediation. The least likely but strategically desirable option is the start of a new round of negotiations with the participation of mediators, the UN, the EU, China, and Qatar. The negotiation process could include issues such as the nuclear program, security in the Persian Gulf, and restrictions on the deployment of weapons. This requires a political decision in Washington, Tehran, and Jerusalem, something that is not yet in sight. There are also intermediate options between these scenarios, including cyber warfare, information attacks, targeted sabotage, and increased sanctions pressure. But one thing is clear: the old security architecture in the Middle East has been destroyed, and a new order has not yet been formed. At the heart of everything that is happening is not just a clash between states, but a conflict between models of the future. Israel is a Western technological bastion closely linked to the US. Iran is a theocratic republic building a regional order based on ideological and military pressure. The US is a global arbiter whose influence is increasingly being challenged on both the military and moral fronts. This triangle can no longer coexist in its current form, and if the current phase of confrontation ends, it will not be the end of the conflict, but only a transition to another form. The institutionalization of the confrontation is possible, the creation of coalitions, the proliferation of weapons, and the reformatting of alliances. Already, against the backdrop of the conflict, ties are strengthening between Iran, Russia, and China, as well as between Israel, India, and a number of Arab countries. The Middle East is becoming the arena for a global geopolitical realignment. In this context, it is important to ask the main question: what is the world doing? The answer is almost nothing. A tired Europe, a divided West, a calculating East. Only a few countries, Oman, Qatar, Turkey, are trying to play the role of mediators. But without the consent of Washington and Tehran, they will not be able to influence the trajectory of the conflict. The main risk is miscalculation. One volley, one downed plane, one piece of false intelligence, and the situation could spiral out of control. That is why it is now more important than ever to put real diplomatic mechanisms back on the agenda, including direct lines of communication between the military, regular risk assessments, and independent inspections. The conflict between Iran, Israel, and the U.S. is not just a local confrontation. It is a mirror reflecting the entire architecture of the 21st century, fragile, polarized, distrustful. And if we do not want this century to be a century of destruction, today is the moment for awareness and action. Today, the world is on the brink. The conflict between Iran, Israel, and the U.S. is not just another outbreak of violence. It is a warning. It is a reminder that stability is not a given, but the result of effort. If you believe that such events deserve attention, spread the word, share this video, discuss it with your friends, write your opinions. Silence is an ally of chaos. We must demand transparency from politicians, accountability from the media, and common sense from society. Otherwise, we will all pay for the mistakes. Subscribe if you care about the truth, not just headlines. Here you will find only verified facts, in-depth analysis, and an independent perspective.